Namaste. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Yes Talk. Today with us, we have a speaker, Professor David Marshak. He's an expert in the field of parenting and education and has been conducting workshops for both educators and parents for many decades now. David was the founding president of the Self-Design Graduate Institute and continues to be the Professor Emeritus at Seattle University. He has 40 plus years of engagement with the works of Sri Aurobindo, and his works highlight the need to nurture the evolution of consciousness. And this is what he has documented in his writings. It's two of his books, Evolutionary Parenting and The Common Vision, Parenting and Education for Wholeness, are based on his decades of work on parenting and education. His recent guidebook on inviting youth to claim the power of their imagination is something which is related to today's topic as well. He will be speaking about how the youth is the future and what is the place of youth in the society and what are they capable of. And this is what will be our exploration today. So I will just play the video.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you this evening or morning. It's evening here in California. And I look forward to the opportunity to share with you some ideas that I've been working on for many years about how we really have come to misunderstand youth over the last 100 and some years. And one caveat I'd like to begin with by saying is, I will give one piece of data about India as just a way of framing some of what I'm going to share with you. But I am not an expert on India, and I'm not going to make assertions about India or judgments about India. I will leave that to those of you who know much more about it than I do. So essentially, I'm going to be talking about the West, industrial societies in the West, and particularly the United States. So I'm going to share my screen here. And let me make this okay. So this is the title. I'm sure you're all familiar with the amazing and intriguing story of Greta Thunberg. So my argument tonight is that she is unique. I have to grant that. There's no one else like Greta. And yet in another way, she's not unique, and that she really is part of a wave of youth who are manifesting now. So let me begin to talk about that. So we have, as a species, been around probably for 300,000 years. You know, this number has kept changing in my lifetime. I recall when it was about 120,000 and went to 180,000. And as recently as 3 years ago, there were some findings that suggested 300,000, although this is still, you know, in being debated among the experts. So the modern human brain, as we know it, they're pretty clear. It's somewhere between 100,000 and 35,000 years ago. And obviously that's an enormous amount of time. But even if we took the 35,000 years, so this, you know, the shortest possible time, the separation of youth, by that I mean people ages 13 through 19, from adult life, took place in the blink of an eye compared to 35,000 years ago. So we're talking about essentially 100 years or 120 years at the beginning, really, of the 20th century in the United States, and for that matter, in the United Kingdom and in Germany, which were the three leading industrial countries in the planet at that time. So we're talking about a radical discontinuity between how we lived and for the vast majority of our existence in some very, very complex societies. You know, you don't have to go back more than 1,000 years or 2,000 years to find very complex societies, you know, certainly in India, in China, in Africa, and in certain ways, even in North America. And in all of these societies, for the most part, youth or humans came to puberty, and then there was some kind of rite of passage, and then human beings in their teens took on adult roles. So this is a key element in the argument I'm going to share with you tonight. So what happened? Oh yes, here's just the one piece of data. I was curious about high school enrollment in India, and I'll talk a little bit later about high school enrollment in the United States. But these are the data that I found from the Ministry of Education. You know, so basically 78% in secondary and 51% in the higher secondary. So this is about where the United States reached in about 1930. And I say that not as a statement of pride, just as a statement of history, because you're going to find that I am actually very critical of high school, although it depends on what moment in industrial and social development a society is. And I'll talk more about that later. So what happened around 1900? Again, in the 19th century in the United States, and this was true in the United Kingdom, but I'll stop saying the United Kingdom, I'll just say the United States. Very few people went to high school. Almost no females went to high school. And the majority, it was maybe 2 or 3% of the males went to high school and graduated. And they came from two different groups. So one group were the children of the corporate ruling class. So essentially the monetary elite sent their male children to preparatory schools, which were schools where the students lived in residence, away from their families. And of course, this was partly get them away from their governesses and get them to toughen up. And then the other group were young boys and young men who wanted to become Protestant ministers. These were the two groups that actually went to high school, graduated from high school, and then actually went to university. Again, it was 3% perhaps of the population. So G. Stanley Hall was really the first famous psychologist in the United States. He created a university called Clark University in Massachusetts, which he hoped would become a competitor to Harvard and Yale and Princeton. Of course, it didn't happen, but that was his ambition. He was the president of the founding president of the American Psychological Association. He brought Sigmund Freud to the United States for a tour. So he was a very large player in the scene of intellect and academe. And he published a book in 1904, which you see the title of on the screen, and created the category of adolescence. He invented adolescence. I don't think it's too much to say. He created the term, and he invented the imagery of what it meant to be an adolescent. And they're 2 volumes. They're pretty much unreadable, but they're recognizable in certain ways. And again, so what did he know about adolescence? The only people that he knew between the age of 13 and 19 were these boys, men, who either came from the corporate elite families or wanted to be ministers. These are the ones that the population he drew on. He didn't know any other adolescents. So it's important to understand that, what he was drawing on. So what did he say? And I use the term putative because obviously I'm going to contest this. So characteristics, and actually for these I found an Indian source, a Professor Raja in Kerala. And what he talked about, you can see sexual maturation, physical growth, turbulent, tumultuous emotionality, risky behaviors. An estimated 10 to 25% of young people have at least one psychosocial problem. So this is a contemporaneous description from an Indian psychologist that is pretty close to what our friend G. Stanley Hall said in 1904. Interesting, isn't it? Whoops, I went too far. Let's go one, here we are. So in addition to that, though, in school-based societies, another characteristic or other characteristics of adolescence are isolation from adults and adult society. We send youth to school for 30 or 40, 50 hours a week, and then we give them homework for another 20, 30 hours a week. So we occupy them in their own domain to a great deal. This, of course, opens up the potential for youth culture. And I'll talk more about this a little bit later on in the talk. There was no youth culture in the 19th century. And in fact, there is no youth culture in societies where youth don't go to high school. Although now, because of the pervasive access to cell phones throughout the planet, there actually is youth culture now, even in societies where there are no high schools. So, things are changing quickly because of the technological innovations. And the cell phones, of course, are changing everything pretty quickly. So part of the youth culture is to be contemptuous of adults, to separate from adults. The adults have put us off here, and, we're going to have anger with them. And then, of course, the psychosocial disorders. There's something wrong with youth. That's the central part of Hall's description, is that there's something really wrong with youth. And just to illustrate that, let's see, I have to move this around here so I can see my quote. On page 522, of course, it took me a long time to find this. He said, and I quote, "They're passionate, irascible, and apt to be carried away by their impulses. They're slaves to their passion, as their ambition prevents their ever brooking a slight and renders them indignant at the mere idea of enduring an injury." And I call this, maligning youth. This is such an intense and negative description of a whole stage of human unfoldment. I think this is a big part of the problem, because this characterization that Hall created in 1904, based on a very slight data set, certainly in the United States, became part of the expectation of how youth would behave, who they were and how they would behave. And I imagine that even, well, I'm not going to talk about India, never mind. I'm tempted, but I won't. I'll leave that to you all. So another part of this story is high school. And again, as I said before, in the 19th century in the United States, very few people went to high school. Almost all of them were male. And again, they came from these two categorizations because there really was no advantage economically to going to high school, because very few jobs required a high school graduation. Teaching in school didn't require high school graduation. Working in newspapers, most of the newspaper men in the 19th century didn't go to high school. You can go on and on. Working in factories didn't require, there was really very little to be gained. And so there was very little attendance. But what began to happen was that school attendance began to grow in the 19th century, because as nations industrialized, somebody had to take care of the kids. And so school was created, both for childcare and then again to prepare children for work lives and industrial jobs. And the school paradigm that, unfortunately, from my point of view, is still dominant in the United States in 2022, enforced by the rule of law, was invented in Prussia, in the first decade of the 19th century. And because Prussia was industrializing more quickly than any other society. And one of the kind of shadows of history is that because of the terrible behavior of the German nation in the 20th century, and particularly in World War II, it's become forgotten to a large extent that in the 19th century, Prussia, and then after 1870, the complete German nation, was the most advanced technological, industrial, and for that matter, philosophical. Germany had the best universities, so on and so on. And, German philosophers and poets and novelists from the 19th century, rank with anyone. So the German school model was seen as the most advanced and was copied in the United States in the 1840s. And unfortunately, we are still doing it. All they've evolved somewhat, we haven't. So there was always this contradictory notion in school in the United States. One was teaching for industrial compliance. That's why we have school days that are in conventional schooling that are organized by the clock. And this intensifies when you get to high school. I mean, no rational person thinking about learning for youth would set up a system like the high school that I taught in 50 years ago, where we had 7 44-minute periods starting at 7:20 in the morning. And every 44 minutes, we had 4 minutes in between periods. We had 20 minutes for lunch. This is not designed for learning. This is designed to teach obedience. And it did to a large extent. But nonetheless, even with all of that, the United States has also had this belief in schooling for self-development and democratic citizenship. And there always has been some truth to that. My father, who was actually born in this country, but whose parents came from Russia in 1900, had the benefit of the New York City public schools. And then they had the benefit of City College of New York, which in the 1930s was free. And not only did it teach him for his profession as an accountant, but it also taught him about democracy. So some of that was real and some of it still is real. So in the United States, the goal of universal high school enrollment and completion really started around 1910. And by 1950, we had pretty much achieved universal enrollment. Now, we've never gotten past 85% or so, completion. And that's about where we are now and where we've been off and on for 40 years. So, but the key characteristic of high school is, in addition to what I've been talking about, is youth culture, is the isolation of youth from the adult culture. So here there's another element that came into play, and that's technology. So youth culture in a mass way began in the 1950s with the advent of transistor radios. And I can speak to this from my own life. So, and when I was a young child, we had a radio from the 1940s, and it was a large cabinet, maybe 3 feet wide and 3 feet deep and 5 feet high. And, it was something that sat in the living room, and children did not have access to programming. Adults programmed it. Children sat around and joined in. And there was a whole society of radio drama that went on in the United States in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But in the 1950s, the transistor was invented. And by 1958, a 10-year-old like me, could purchase a transistor radio for $10, which was an enormous amount of money at the time. I think I saved for a year, because $10 then is about $100 now. So, it was a lot of money. But the transistor radio was, this size, a couple of inches wide, a couple of inches deep, and 5 inches high. And you could hide it under your pillow and listen to rock and roll at night while your parents thought you were sleeping, as I did many evenings. So the youth culture really took off in the 60s, and some of the icons you're familiar with, so I'm not going to go over them again. But again, I would argue that this is largely a function of the kids, the youth, being kicked out of adult culture, being excluded from adult society, and the response being, well, if you don't want us, we're going to get our own thing going here. And certainly Elvis Presley and the Beatles were really very, very good at this. What happened after that, of course, was that corporations realized, that there was an incredible amount of money to be made here. And I would argue that, with a couple of exceptions, from the 1970s on, the youth culture has really been manipulated and controlled by corporate power. And, there's some pushback now on social media. And I don't really know how much, since I'm not on social media, I can't really say how much of the pushback is meaningful, because there's still a whole lot of corporate media being sold to youth. But my point in all of this is that it's a tremendous loss, both to adult society and to youth, to exclude people between the ages of 13 and 19 from adult society. And I'm going to go on and explain why that is next here. Let's see, let me find my next slide here. Okay, so I'm just trying to bring this together. We defined adolescence in the ways that I've described, and we also misunderstood the capacities of youth, focusing. It's not that the negative potentials aren't there. It's just that the balance is misunderstood, and that the capacity to evoke the positive potentials is minimized when we lock kids up in the teen ghetto. We maximize the potential for positive when we engage youth in adult society, when we value them. And this is my main premise. When we value youth and we engage them in adult society, we maximize the potential that they have to offer, and we can learn a lot from them. And certainly we always need to learn more. Now, where is my cursor? Here we go. Okay. So one of the most significant writers about human development in the United States in the last 50 years is a man named Joseph Chilton Pierce. And I don't really have any idea whether Joe is known in India or not. I know that he's familiar with Sri Aurobindo and the Mother because he wrote a wonderful review of my book, The Common Vision, which certainly has a great deal of explication about Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. And he clearly understood, what the book was about. But I didn't know Joe personally. I met him a couple of times in passing, but I really never had a chance to sit down and have a conversation with him. And unfortunately died recently, although he did get into his late 80s. So that was, can't complain about that. But one of the things that Joe wrote about that has always stood out for me, he described these three qualities of soul in youth that helped us to understand the positive qualities of youth. So the first one is this idealism, an energetic idealism. And this notion, one of the qualities of youth is that when they come out of childhood and begin looking around at adult society, they tend to see the problems, what's wrong. They tend to see the distance between what they may have been told and what's the reality is. Or even without that, without parents, showing them some kind of incomplete picture as a child, which, we would all do. We're not going to, layer out all of the negative aspects of society to children. But they come awake, they come aware, they look around and they see the ways in which things aren't working. And particularly in relation to issues of equity and fairness and justice. So, but they also envision the possibilities for rectifying these failures. And they also are not limited in their idealism in what could be done to improve society. And some of these aspects of idealism, may be unrealistic, but who knows what's realistic? For example, if you had told me in 2005, say, that 4 billion or 4.5 billion people living on the planet today have smartphones, I would have thought you were crazy. I mean, who could have, anticipated that we would move from a world where you needed to string wires thousands and thousands of miles to connect people to a world where, I can talk with people all over the world, on video, on their smartphones. I mean, this is completely unpredictable. I mean, it is in science fiction, so some people predicted it, but the timing of it is completely unpredictable. So again, this idealism, one of the things that Joe wrote about, which always struck me, and particularly when in the first 20 years, I worked with adolescents directly, I learned very quickly, I was not someone who said, well, no, you can't do that, or no, that won't work, or no, that's silly, or no, that's crazy. I learned to say, well, let's look into that and see, how might that work? So I think this is a really important character. Well, they're all important, but this is one that, that's really important to begin thinking about and feeling into as we engage with youth. The second one, here we go. And so this is really very much a soul quality, a feeling of great expectations. So this is really an emergence into consciousness of the soul. To translate this from Pierce's language, I would argue, into spiritual language. Not that he didn't use spiritual language, but more explicitly into the soul. This barely conscious recognition that we each have a capacity to experience a calling in our lives, and that a calling is the expression of the will, which is the expression of the soul. So again, in many normative situations, when youth begin to have the nerve to express great expectations or something approaching great expectations, they often get shut down and they say, oh, well, that's not real. Or, don't be so full of yourself, or don't be egotistical. And parents and teachers and family members, it's not that they're, want to be harmful. It's just that these are norms, at least in the American culture, that have come again from the definition of adolescence that goes back to G. Stanley Hall. That this is an excess of some kind, or this is some kind of violation of morality, or, that nobody's supposed to feel that they have a calling, or recognize that they have a calling. So again, this is, they're all important. This is equally important. The capacity for adults engaging with youth, to recognize this expression and to support it. And maybe at times it will be egotism. There's no question that people in these age ranges can be egotistical. Absolutely. But we really don't know in the moment for any human being who's expressing this feeling of calling what it is. There's no way to know for us to know. And the only way for it to have its own life is for it to be respected. So the third potential, move this around here, and this is related to the second one, the hidden greatness that each individual is important. That my place here, and I'm speaking as a youth, that my place here on the planet is important. It's not that I'm more important than you, or I'm more important than anyone else. We're all important. We all have something of importance to contribute. And again, so the word of hidden greatness, this is a language that is, I've shared this with a good number of folks over the last 20 years, and many parents have a really hard time with this. Because again, it's that sense of they don't want to spoil their youth, their teen kids, but at the same time, this is not about spoiling, it's about recognition. Okay, so let me talk here. Let me see if I can find, there it is. So where are we now in the history of unfoldment of youth? I think we're really in a new place as a species. I wanted to call this, I did a talk once at a holistic education conference. I called it The Annihilation of High School and Life Beyond Adolescence. It was sort of a joke, I was trying to be funny, but it was the most attended session at the conference, so it did work, I'd say. So we are in a place where many or most youths are still held captive in the high school teen ghetto. And I would say one thing as an aside, that it may very well be in some societies that a high school is a good thing. I don't want to damn schooling, because societies on the planet are in such different places in terms of their unfoldment. And in the United States, for many years, high school, as I said with my father, high school did much more good than it did damage. But 40 years, 35 years later, when I was in high school, I would argue it did much more damage than it did good. The society had evolved. But so it depends on the larger status of the society as a whole. But certainly in the United States, and you'll see most of the examples I picked out are from the United States, more and more youths are escaping or transcending. So you don't necessarily need to escape to transcend. The internet is the variable that changes everything. So the internet is diminishing the perception of national, racial, ethnic differences among the young. And, you know, think about it, you're growing up now, and you have the capacity to engage in, you know, interactions with youth basically all over the planet. You can game with them, you can watch them gaming, you can talk with them, you can social media with them, you can do what we're doing now with them. You know, these young folks growing up now are they're living in a different world. Not to say that it's all good. Obviously, social media is a very mixed blessing. And, you know, there's clearly a lot of negativity and damage that social media has already created in societies, and probably will continue. But there's an enormous amount of positivity. And then thirdly, the internet has empowered youth to create, to invent, and to lead. So the internet has said to youth who have a calling, you know, I'm going to go out and do it. I don't need to wait till I graduate from high school. I don't need to wait till I go to university. I don't need to wait till I'm an adult. I have a calling. I have something to offer. I can be 14 years old and do it now. And I would argue they are. What the numbers are, I have no idea, because I don't see any way of getting numbers. But clearly, this invitation to break out of the teen ghetto and enter into adult society is something that's out there. And so what I want to do for the next 15 minutes is give you some examples of young people who are doing this. So obviously you're familiar with Greta. So most of these are you know, people who live in the United States. There's one or two exceptions, and I'll identify them, but otherwise they're people who live in the United States. And I need to put my glasses on so that I can read some of this to you. So Haley, at the age of 14, became the youngest certified health coach in the United States. And she created a nonprofit organization that provides affordable culinary education to youth in malnourished communities in the United States. And this is unfortunately very common in low-income African-American communities, that there isn't access to or recognition of healthy vegetables in particular. So she began this work at 14, and it continues. Boyan Slat is actually Dutch. At the age of 16, he decided that he wanted to clean up the plastic in the oceans. And so he's somewhat famous. You may have heard of him. He's been out there. So he's raised a couple of $100 million over the last 4, 5, 6 years, and has built, he's now on his third effort to build an enormous wing that would collect plastic in the ocean through tidal energy. And you can look him up. He has a website. Obviously, he's hired engineers who are older than he is. But the point with Boyan, I think that's really critical and interesting, is that when he decided to do this, you know, it was common knowledge that this was impossible. You know, if you talk to adults, they would say this was impossible. But at 16, he said, you know, I'm going to do this. So he's been working, I think, for 9 years now. Some of the young folks that I'm going to share with you, they live in the United States. They're Americans. They grew up here, but you'll see that they have Indian ancestry. And you know, for whatever it's worth, the United States has been blessed. You know, it's India's loss, but it's our gain. And some wonderful Indian Americans who have joined us, or well, I'm sure she grew up here. So she invented something called the hemocam at 18. a machine learning web that can employ any smartphone to diagnose sickle cell disease with 95% accuracy when combined with a 3D printed microscope that attaches to a smartphone camera. So sickle cell anemia is prevalent among Africans and African Americans. It's a genetically based disease. And the equipment in the Western world to diagnose this basically exists only in hospitals. So this is an enormously important invention that's now being used in many different societies. So Joshua Wong, you may have heard of, he lives in Hong Kong. And at the age of 14, he was one of the leaders, if you recall, of the so-called umbrella revolution back in 2014. Unfortunately, given what the events in Hong Kong, he's now imprisoned by the Hong Kong government. But he has, led efforts that unfortunately have had, at this point at least, a negative ending. Not because of his efforts have been, really incredible. Mahika Alpeet. So she founded IANA International, an organization that holds a youth innovation lab, which helps young people in developing countries ages 12 to 22 identify problems in their own communities and come up with their own solutions. Her organization has facilitated groups of young change makers in Kenya, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Rwanda. And she lives in California. Ashika actually lives in Washington State. Here we go. So Vitalik Buterin is an interesting fellow. He is a Russian American, and he invented the cryptocurrency Ethereum. I think he did it when he was 17. Now, cryptocurrencies, that's a whole other story. Are they good? Are they bad? It's a different discussion. But Ethereum is actually the second largest crypto after Bitcoin. So he's an interesting fellow. I think he's about 25 now. And of course, he's a billionaire. What can we say about capitalism? So Leah Harrell lived in a suburb of Minneapolis. And when she was 16, she founded her local community climate initiative. And then she organized with other high school students and brought a climate change bill to the Minnesota State Legislature, which has partly been adopted, but not entirely because it's too radical for them. But again, the work began when she was 16, and before she even went off to university, she was testifying in front of the legislature and lobbying her legislators and so on, and organizing other folks her own age. So Ayusha Lag was 14. He lives in California too, I think, when he decided that there needed to be a better way to test for food allergies. I think he, if I recall, had a food allergy warning and went through the testing, and the testing is pretty awful, and decided that there should be a better way to do this when he was 14. So he researched this for 3 years in his parents' basement, and created a type of DNA test that could be used to identify whether someone has a deadly food allergy or just an inconvenient, non-life-threatening sensitivity. So again, this is obviously a youth who was supported by his parents, who had access to resources, who had, he didn't have any sense, well, this is not something that a teenager should be doing in his parents' basement, and had the capacity using resources that were available to him on the internet. Adam Avon, when he was 14, created the Woof Shanti Children's Wellness Foundation to teach mindfulness. He lives in Florida. And this was a foundation to promote health and wellness and positivity and mindfulness. And I believe, if I recall, they've now worked with about 75,000 children in schools throughout Florida and several other states. So I think he's about 20 or 22 now. if I recall. And so Megan Warren lives in Ohio, and her mother was a school librarian, and she became aware at the age of 11 that there were a lot of children who didn't have any books at home. So she founded a nonprofit called Books for Bedtime, and began collecting books to donate to children who didn't have books at home. And at the time of this research was about 3 years ago when I actually came across her. She had collected more than 70,000 books and donated them to families. Joshua Williams lives in Florida, created an organization called Joshua's Heart, and they do food distribution to low-income families. Particularly during the COVID pandemic, there's been whole issues about food availability. So he started this when he was 13. This young man is particularly interesting. He lives in Texas, and he created a mobile COVID testing lab before the state of Texas opened any testing labs. He just, went out and somehow, I don't know the details, I've been trying to look this up, but somehow got the technology to do COVID testing, and then was given the use of a vehicle, kind of a trailer vehicle, and started driving around, offering COVID tests to people for free. Fascinating young man. So Anika at 17, so there's a contest, 3M, which is a major, the United States chemical and home supply corporation, has a young scientist challenge every year. And she discovered a lead molecule that will selectively bind to the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that may have some long-term use in treating COVID in the future. This is basically pure research that she did in high school or at home, I'm not quite sure. This young man actually began inventing when he was a kid, when he was a child, and has a whole series of inventions. The most interesting one is that, you probably use sandbags in India. We use sandbags to try to stop flooding. And sandbags are a very limited technology. They're a lot of work to fill. They're really heavy to move. They don't work that well. They leak. So he invented a sandless sandbag that is more effective in keeping water out and weighs about 10% of what sandbags weigh, and is now being used actually in different parts of the US. I'm almost done here. Let's see, two more, I'll stop. So this young woman, Hannah Herbst, she created an ocean energy prototype that seeks to offer a stable power source to developing countries using untouched energy from ocean currents. So again, the idea of this is something that would float in the ocean and use the wave movement in the ocean to generate electricity. And so she created a prototype that actually achieved this. And then finally, Gabriel, let's see if I can get this, there we go. Whoops, I went too far. Here's Gabriel. He developed a biodegradable carbon battery that can use motion-powered energy to harness free energy, and he's working on commercializing it. So one of the big problems with carbon batteries is that they create toxic waste. So if you can degrade them, it's a whole other new use for them. So finally, okay, so what about all of this? What I would hope that you might take away from this is the consideration of these 3 points. So one is, we can support and honor youth whose soul manifests this idealism, this creativity, and one of the qualities that I haven't spoken about, but each of these young people come from a place of love. Now, maybe that's not the language they would use, but it's not about self-aggrandizement. You know, they're not into self-aggrandizing themselves. They're into creating something to make a better world. And it's very clear when you read about them or listen to them talk that they come from this idealism, you know, this place of love. We can, and when it's appropriate, assist youth who no longer need or want high school or university to be freed from it. And this is a little bit more controversial. But, you know, it's an interesting premise, which is that if you're doing pure science research when you're 15 in your parents' basement, maybe you should go to university and find mentors, but maybe you don't need to. And then finally, when we respect the genius of youth, youth will be open to receiving mentoring from those who are older, particularly elders. And so this is one of the greatest potentials. If we can re-engage youth in adult society and respect youth and honor them, then elders also have a role in engaging with youth. And again, this is in some sense, the back to the future, which is, I would argue, is inherent in our species, which is that there's a quality of youth, of energy, of creativity, of, going forward. But there's also a quality of elders, which is wisdom and experience. And these go together when the quality of emotionality is respectful and inviting. So thank you very much. I hope this has been of value, and I'll stop right here. And let me stop screen sharing.
Thank you, David. To a devotee of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, your talk was like music to ears. One could see in action evolution taking place, and all these young boys and girls you talked about towards the end. They were sort of fitting into the description of the sun-eyed children of a marvelous dawn, as Sri Aurobindo has called them in Savitri, the sun-eyed children of a marvelous dawn. Would you like to answer a few questions if Aditi or I have some?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to confess I didn't make it through Savitri in its entirety. But I love that image that you just offered and that Sri Aurobindo offered, and because I think it's exactly right on. And of course, he obviously foresaw this coming. So, yeah.
Aditi, do you have any question?
Yes, I just wanted to know your views more in terms of, you spoke about how youth is exploring so much and they've become kind of independent. But also there's a pressure of, say, at least for India, I can speak about, I see youth around. There's one sense that you want to follow your calling, and there's another sense that you have a pressure of a degree. And often people are, especially at this age, lost that they don't feel satisfied when they go to the university because the university is not catering to the needs. But yet, as a society, they know that they need that degree if they want to pursue their dreams. So they're often, I often feel that they're trapped in a way that I don't want to go to the place where I go every day because that's not serving what I require. But I also know that I have to express something which I have. I need that as a certificate or whatever. So how does one at this age solve this conflict? Like, what are your suggestions?
Well, that exists in the United States as well. So it's not something that, is only in India. And what I can say to it is that it really requires a quality of faith in the unfoldment of the soul. And, when I'm engaged with and support parents, which I've done again for many years, not so much anymore, but did for many years, that they supported their child, their youth, their young adult child in his or her passion. recognizing that there was some risk involved in that, because the the sense of the economic anxiety is that you need to go to the university and get your credential and go into the workplace with that credential and become secure. And of course, the fallacy in that is that there's no security. You can have a doctorate from the best university in the United States, and you can still have your job removed from existence. So the security is really false, I would argue. But the more important point is, do we trust the calling? And it can be difficult. Again, one of the, when I did parenting workshops in Seattle, which I did for about 20 years, I did this, it wasn't mostly with youth, it was mostly with parents who had children, between the age of 1 and 11 or so. But one of the common experiences that they shared was that they were aligned themselves with this perception that what they wanted to do was to support the unfoldment of their child. And they had the consciousness to engage with that, more or less. I mean, no one's 100%. There's always anxiety in parenting. Am I doing the right thing? Will it work out, et cetera, et cetera. But mostly but in many cases, they were being criticized by their own parents or by their siblings or by their grandparent. There were people in their families who said, what you're doing is spoiling your child. You're giving into your child's egotism by inviting your child to unfold, as much as possible according to the will, according to her will and his will and the soul. So again, there's no universal response that says this is the answer. The answer comes in the life of each individual and each family, and the capacity to recognize and honor the soul, and to live with the anxiety, if there's anxiety. I had that experience in my own life, and my parents really didn't have a choice about it, because I grew up at a time of intense youth rebellion in the 1960s in the United States. And looking back at it, when I got to be in my 40s, I had to apologize to my parents, for the intensity of my rebellion, so they appreciated that. So.
Aditi, any more questions?
No, in that sense, there are a lot of questions in my head right now, but I think this for now answers the faith element. I do understand, and that's what even I share with the students I interact, that if you are confident that this is what your calling is, everybody will come around. You just have to stick to it and continue following. But I also wanted to understand the parents and the teachers' perspective, because if somebody is stopping you, from parents' perspective, it is more out of fear. And that fear somehow has that love infused that something should not go wrong with my child. And from the teacher's perspective, it's more of responsibility, that I feel responsible. You have come to the institute and I should give you what I have. So it's the limitation of the parent as well as the teacher with good intentions that kinds of creates that hurdle. So if any suggestions you have to offer, what a parent should do or what a teacher should do to create that space, 1 or 2 pointers will really help us.
Well, the teacher is in a really different role, because the teacher, has to live within a school, and the school has values and norms. And so the teacher is not a free agent in the way the parents are. So, for teachers, I've been an advocate for what in the United States we call holistic education, for 45 years. And, it's education of the whole person, and it's a recognition more or less of the invitation of the soul to unfold. So but one of the most striking awarenesses I had when I visited the Sri Aurobindo ashram in 1985 and had an opportunity to interview a good number of teachers. So at that point they had so many visitors that they didn't want people in the classrooms except in the kindergarten and the college. So, but I interviewed, I don't know, 40 or 50 teachers. They were very, very generous their time. And what was striking to me was the diversity of pedagogies that were in place. And there were teachers who were quite formal in their British methodology. And that was surprising to me to begin with. And there were teachers who had Montessori backgrounds. There were teachers who had, all kinds of different approaches in pedagogy. But what they all said to me was that in some sense is that the pedagogy is not the most important element. It's the sole connection between the teacher and the students. And so this was a school where this was the ideology of the school. And what it allowed them then, which I thought in many ways was brilliant, is that they didn't have to have conflict about pedagogy. They each had their own responsibility, but it was a given that they each brought themselves from their own spiritual practice and their own awakening into the classroom as souls. And so, but then they were in a school where that was the norm. And I would imagine that if somehow someone showed up, I don't know, in the International Center for Education who was not doing that, that person would be asked to leave fairly quickly because they wouldn't be effective in that norm. So again, they're really different roles in terms of the responsibility. But teachers can have enormous impact. And in some ways, teachers can add to what the parents are not able to give. And I've seen that happen, many times. And in my own career as an educator in the United States, because we're still doing the Prussian model, we do this incredibly stupid thing in grades, kindergarten through 8, where, for the most part, children get a new teacher every year. So what that means is that, after the child and the teacher and the parents have built a relationship for 9 or 10 months, we take all of that relationship value, we toss it in the garbage, and we start all over again. Even though we know from, mainstream psychological research that the most important thing in schooling, particularly for children, is the relational quality between the teacher and the child and the parents. That's what maximizes learning and happiness. So this isn't, the Prussians in 1810 didn't know that, and, can't fault them on it. So, so one of the ways in which I worked as an educator and as an educational professor was to support 3-year relationships in elementary schools between teachers and students and parents, which there were quite a number of them before our current federal law went into in 2002 and created every year testing and basically destroyed most of them. But what I saw repeatedly in these 3-year relationships, this is not language I would have used in public schools in the United States because it would have been inappropriate. But what I saw was teachers engaging on a soul level with children.
Redefined the image of adolescents. Stanley Hall on one hand and Joseph Pearce on the other, and obviously, Joseph Pearce and you are in the same camp. It also shows how the intellect can portray an image based on some logic, based on some data, and come up with two startlingly contrasting images. Because in fact, both have a grain of truth, But then there is a certain value to seeing, to creating an image which is positive rather than negative. Having said that, I have one question. Courage, idealism, love, creativity, which you talked about, have always been a characteristic of the youth. And particularly because of the courage that they have, they also seem rash and unrealistic and impractical at times to adults. And that to some extent explains a phenomenon which has been looked at in a rather neutral way, and that is the generation gap. So the generation gap has always been there, but do you think the generation gap is manifesting more frequently and in more positive ways now, giving sort of an expression to the evolutionary thrust, or is it just that we are noticing it more because of having smartphones and the communications being better? So what do you think, is happening? Is it just a greater awareness of the generation gap, or is it something really new and startling happening, showing us that the human race is poised for a leap in evolution?
Well, it clearly seems to me that change is accelerating, and I certainly hope that that acceleration is an acceleration in consciousness. The insight into this that I want to share in response to your question actually comes from Margaret Mead. And Margaret Mead was one of the first anthropologists in the United States, and one of the wisest academics in the 20th century from my point of view. And in her last book, I think, which published in 1975, Culture and Commitment, she said, well, there's really three different ways to organize the relationship between the young and the older folks in the society. And she had labels for these, which I'm not going to try to come up with because I won't get them right, but I could send this to you if you're interested. But so basically, for most of human history, change has either not happened at all, or it's been very, very, very slow. And again, take the 35,000 years, go back to the cave drawings in Lascaux and France. So for most of that time, things didn't change all that much. And then beginning 200 years ago or so, with the Industrial Revolution, things began to change more quickly. And then that acceleration, has intensified. Although for the people who lived, in, let's say, the first 80 years of the 20th century, there was a whole lot of change. If you think about it, airplanes and telephones and radio and television and travel, and then the beginning of computers and so on. So what Margaret Mead said is that in that time of relative stasis or relatively slow change, the old folks really did know more about the reality than the young folks, because they had lived longer. They'd been around longer. They had more experience. And so they knew more about how things worked. That really, beginning in the 20th century, when the rate of change began to accelerate, we began to move into a more equal relationship, because on one hand, the young knew more about the present than the old, but the old still knew a good deal about how things worked and how they had worked historically. And that this is what the generation gap and the conflict in the generation gap is about. It's about each generation, in some sense, saying, we know more than you do. And what Mead argued is that we need to evolve to a different norm where there's a recognition of the distinction. The distinction is that the young know more about the present in many ways, because they see the present more clearly, because they don't have 50 or 70 years or 90 years of filter to look at the present. For example, I know relatively little about social media because I chose not to participate in it mostly, but I understand that it's really, really important. And I know, what I read about it, but I don't know experientially. And I know there's a lot of people, I know that people my age who have grandchildren are into social media, but a lot of us don't have grandchildren, so we're not into social media. But the other part of it, and that she anticipated this recognition of youth that I've shared with you, that Joe Pierce shared in his work, that when the older folks acknowledge that young folks know more about the present, see it more clearly, and express that respectfully and inquire, then the young folks will be interested in the wisdom of experience that the old folks have. And I've had that experience many, many times in the last 15 years, engaging with teenagers, engaging with young adults, where I begin that engagement by asking them a question. I don't begin by telling them something. I begin by, I say, I don't really understand this thing. Well, I had this conversation I remember a couple of years ago with, my great nephew, who is now 19, who was in 16. It was right at the beginning of TikTok. And, I'd looked at TikTok, and TikTok in the beginning, it seemed completely absurd to me, these 15-second, thingies of people doing dumb things. And I asked him, so what is the attraction of TikTok? And he explained it to me, and of course it's evolved since then. And, now you have the two nations that are engaged in conflict, indirectly, Russia and the United States, are both engaging in conflict on TikTok. That's how quickly things have changed. So I think Margaret Mead was really a genius, and in many, many different ways. But this is something that she saw so clearly. And I think it's another critical piece of this understanding. It's not that the old folks need to go away and shut up. It's that we need to learn how to engage in ways where initially we inquire and we learn. And then when that happens, then young folks will ask us, they'll inquire, and they'll be interested in learning, because respect builds connection, and it builds relationship. And that's, what we need. And to kind of reconnect, get the young out of the teen ghetto, and get the old folks out of the old folks' homes. In the United States anyway. I'm sure it's different in India, so.
Thank you, David. That was a very comprehensive and well-argued answer. Towards the end, you again mentioned India. So may I ask you a question around that? You said that you were feeling tempted to speak about India, but would much rather resist that. Doesn't matter. Even if you are not an expert on India, you can say what you feel, because you've had a reasonable contact with India. And sometimes it helps to get a view from someone who knows less and who is from outside. And that helps us see our faults better. And I'm sure, being an India lover and having had a contact with the Sri Aurobindo and the Mother and many other seers and sages from the East, you would be what Sri Aurobindo calls a sympathetic critic, not a hostile critic. So we would love to listen to what you have to say about India.
I'm not even sure where to start, but I guess my vision for the evolution of consciousness, would be a kind of a global society that both retains the individual qualities of first of all, very old civilizations, and of the wisdom that comes from them. And in addition, though, the engagement in a peaceful way, in the present and the immediate future. And this notion, I see that, obviously both with India and China, these are both ancient civilizations that have an enormous amount to offer, not just the residents of those societies, but everyone. And the United States is a baby. Even Western Europe is a baby compared to these civilizations. But in the present, there's a whole lot of challenge involved, and I don't know. I really don't know. India is so complex and so heterodox that I really, don't, really don't know where to begin. The one thing I would say, and I guess I would say this of any nationalism, whether it's Hindu nationalism or Buddhist nationalism or Christian nationalism or Jewish nationalism, these are all reactionary forms. And we live in a world now where there's enormous attraction for these reactionary forms in the United States as well. And incredible. I never would have thought that these reactionary elements in the United States would elect a president. It would have been inconceivable to me 30 years ago. But this is all a reaction to the intensification of the positive potential, the positive change. And the positive change in evolution, is this idea of this global identity of people, but also there's no need you don't have to give up your local identity, your local tradition, your local cultures to participate in the global consciousness. Human beings are capable of both. And in fact, it's evident that that's very clear with the evolution of consciousness. So we're in a really challenging time in the sense that the reactionary forces are stronger all over the planet, and they're engaged in conflict. And, I would argue that we need to respond in consciousness, not in violence, in love, not in hatred. And it's a challenge. Personally, I feel a challenge, in trying to stay with that kind of positive consciousness, as opposed to, going into the lower vital emotions myself, because they're all certainly there. I haven't evolved beyond them. But the potential positivity, I believe, is enormous. And to some extent, I think there is a direct correlation between the intensity of the reactionary energy and the power of the positive energy. I think that's why the reactionary energy is so strong, that folks with that consciousness are profoundly threatened, and understandably so. So it's a very challenging time, but the potential for positive movement, I think, is really very real. In India, in the United States, in China, and even in Russia, certainly in Western Europe and in Africa, all over the planet. I think I'll stop there. Get myself in trouble.
Yes, Aditi, please go ahead. I think it's young people like you about whom David has been talking, and I'm sure knowing you, you have a very quick mind. I'm sure you'll have a few valuable things to say and maybe a question to ask.
No, I think I'm just still stuck on the idea which he shared about the respect element, no? That how the young needs to respect the old and the old needs to respect the young. I think that is what I'm also seeing more and more, especially through the power of social media. I recognize that though we talk about it as something which is overpowering in a way, but I also see it as the old generation getting a voice to express and connect with the young. And that becomes a platform that no matter now, maybe at home, they are not sitting and talking, but they have a platform where they can share and both can find their place. So in that sense, also as a country, I see a lot of people coming together and expressing, and that expression is slowly taking form. And so maybe at the older generation now in their youth were not able to express due to certain conditions or situations as a society, but now they see that the young is taking it forward and in a much more evolved manner. So I think that is the plus thing which I see in all these things, and that is what I would like to keep my attention on and see and give my energy of how this can be facilitated more in the right direction. That's what is my thoughts right now.
Well, I think you're exactly right, and I'm sure you know more about it than I do. But just conceptually, we've moved from, if you think about radio, which is really 100 years ago in the West anyway, to television, which is 70 years ago, to the early internet and broadcasting on the everyone who has access to social media can broadcast, and they do. And again, if you look at it, my understanding of people who have large audiences, at least in the United States, a lot of it seems about frivolous consumption. A lot of it seems to be about reactionary right-wing politics, conspiracy theories. But there's also clearly a lot of it that's also about personal sharing. And there's also a lot of it that's about very progressive, constructive politics and people using social media to engage, in constructive. There's an organization in the United States called the Sunrise Movement, which has been working on climate change for 6 or 7 years now. And when it was started by a group of folks who I believe were between the ages of 18 and 22. And I think they thought they were going to change the world and get the Green New Deal in place in 5 years. And when they didn't, they've committed to the work. But one of the interesting things they've done is that the original organizers, who are now in their late 20s, have reorganized the central leadership group. And while 1 or 2 of them have stayed in it, they've recruited another group of people between the ages of 17 and 21 to be the leadership group for what is now a national organization with dozens of local chapters and tens of thousands of donors. I give them money. I'm too old. They don't want me around. I'm too old, but I think what they're doing is great. But what I see in that is that in that willingness of the leadership to recognize that they want the movement led by people who were the age that they were when they started. That's brilliant. And it just shows, that their engagement with it is not about ego. It's not about how cool am I that I lead this organization and built it, and now it's a national organization, but it's recognizing that it's an organization. The passion of it comes from youth, because these are the people who are most threatened by climate change, whose lives are going to be most distorted and harmed by it. And when I was reading, I read everything they send me because I'm fascinated by it. And so when I read recently that they had, reconstituted the leadership group, I was so impressed by their willingness to do that, because it shows a recognition of the evolution of consciousness. So I think we'll see more of that. I think that's the kind of consciousness that's evolving. And I'm sure it's not that the people in their late 20s have stepped out of the work. They may be working in a different way in the movement. They may be doing, other things. But that recognition of that particular energy, of youth, it's just so impressive to me. So social media, it's an open question. Will the good outweigh the bad? Who knows? I don't know. I'm the last person to ask about that.
I think the key, like everywhere else, the key is the balance in all aspects of life, including social media. And that's what one needs to know how to use it. And that does the trick, I believe. So, yeah.
Well, again, I think that, there was the fundamental error that was made in the creation of the internet at the beginning. And this really essentially came from the fact that the people creating the internet were sort of libertarian teenage boys. And I say that literally, American teenage libertarian boys. And they set up an internet that didn't require people to actually identify themselves. And I think that was a fundamental category error, because I think if the internet had been set up in a way that you actually had to use your real name and demonstrate that you were a real person when you posted anything, we would be in a very different world. So, but that's what they wanted to do, because they wanted to have what they perceived as freedom. And of course, I would argue that it's essentially, license, licentious, it's an excess. It's a freedom without responsibility, and freedom without responsibility is license. So I don't know if that word translates into India in English, but licentious probably exists, and it's a bad thing. So anyway.
David, your wisdom is truly inexhaustible. And I'm sure there's only a limited amount that we can have in one session, but we'll keep bothering you again and again and again.
Well, that would be delightful. This is really, I've really appreciated not only the opportunity, to give these talks and to speak with you and to see you and all that, but also just the opportunity to engage in refreshing my own thought about these questions. And, that's also been something I've appreciated doing. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope to be invited again.
Thank you on Aditi and my behalf, and on behalf of the entire YES team. And we hope to have you again very soon.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'd say have good morning, and you can say good night.
And you too, have a good evening and sweet dreams.
Thank you. I'll have some sweet dreams tonight. So thank you very much. Take care. Be well.
Thank you, everyone, once again for joining us this evening. We end with the meditative music, and for the next Friday Yes Talk, we will have with us Dr. Baswati Bhattacharya, who will be talking with us on the topic Bridging Ancient and Modern Healing with Ayurveda. So I would request you all to be present with us next Friday as well. And thank you once again. Thank you, everyone.
you.